the resurrection of Jesus never happened. I mean, no, of course it didn't happen. How could it happen? And science, I think, could even go so far as saying it simply could not happen. When you've got a dead body, it's decaying straight away. There's no way that it's going to reconstitute in some way.
The major reason why I believe that Christianity is true is because, and here comes science again as a base, because Christianity is testable.
Oh, nonsense. How can it be tested?
These two men are Oxford emeritus professors, Lennox in math, Atkins in chemistry, and they're not arguing about test tubes. They're arguing about whether the resurrection can even be evaluated like anything else real. For Atkins, a dead body deciding to rise is scientifically absurd, full stop. For Lennox, that's exactly the claim he says he's tested, personally, repeatedly, in other people's lives. Let me know in the comments if you have any interesting take on this topic. All right, let's get into it.
Science deals with real questions. Science deals with questions for which there is evidence. So, whereas a typical religious question might be, what is the purpose of the universe? Science can dismiss that as an irrelevant question. There is no evidence that there is any purpose in the universe. In fact, I think it rather wonderful that this extraordinary collection of galaxies is just hanging there, totally without any purpose whatsoever. I think that's rather grand, frankly, and rather inspiring. So when you ask questions for which there is no evidence, such as that one, what is the purpose of the universe, what is the nature of the afterlife, and all that sort of thing, science need not trouble to try to answer them because they're nonsense questions. Science deals with real questions, questions for which there is evidence. And some of these are very deep, and let's not hide them under a bushel. I think one major question is, why is there something rather than nothing? It certainly seems as though there is something, and we presume that before there was something, there was nothing. So it seems to be a real question, and science has as its objective an attempt to answer that kind of question. Another deep question, of course, is the nature of consciousness and all the attributes of consciousness. We appear to have consciousness. There is evidence that we do. And so it is appropriate for science to tackle that. And by consciousness, I mean all the attributes of consciousness, including morality. And so those are real questions. Those are the questions that science can answer. And there is no doubt in my mind that over the past, let's say 300 years, that science has done its job seriously. That is, collecting evidence, setting it in a network of concepts, and seeing the way that they are mutually supportive. I think there's no doubt that over 300 years we have made extraordinary progress, and there is no reason other than pessimism to expect that science will grind to a halt and not answer all the real great questions of existence.
Thank you very much. So an emphatic yes to the idea that in principle science can explain everything that's worth explaining in that sense. So John, same question to you. Can science explain everything?
Well, obviously not. Brexit, for example. That's a comical response, but I have actually two more answers to the question. You're going to be surprised at how much I agree with Peter, because the definition of science he offered us, that is collecting evidence, making observations, in fact in his book on being, he reduces it beautifully to making observations and comparing notes. if that's what we mean by science, and it's the old meaning of science before the 19th century, then of course science can explain everything, because the very word explanation means making evidence-based observations and notes. So my short answer is, if we accept Peter's first definition, then I agree with him entirely. Science, by definition, explains everything. But of course, the meaning of the word science has changed in England, but not on the continent. In German, Wissenschaft covers the humanities and the natural sciences. And when people these days say science can explain everything, they're not referring simply to making observations and comparing notes at all. For instance, that would apply to any historical or forensic examination. And my faith as a Christian is based precisely on the kind of scientific reasoning that Peter has set forward to us. The main issue, I think, in discussion today is not whether that kind of evidence-based thinking and observation can come to every conclusion. Let me just say, by the way, that from the Christian perspective, Luke, the writer of the third gospel, tells us that that is exactly what his method was. He consulted people, he made observations, and then he put them together. So we'll call that science one. What is, of course, at stake today is the question, can the natural sciences answer every question? And there I think that is simply not the case. The Nobel Prize winner, Peter Medawar, many years ago, he wrote a very interesting book on the limits of science. And he said, we do science a disservice, natural science, if we think it can address any questions. And every question. And he referred to the basic questions of Karl Popper, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? Natural science doesn't answer questions like that. And Medawar added, it is to religion, philosophy, and so on that we must go to answer those questions. I think science is immensely powerful. It is immensely exciting. And it uncovers a vast amount about our universe. But I have a problem by going too far. I'm a mathematician and I'm rather interested in logic. And you know, if we say that science can explain everything, or science is the only way to truth, as it's often put, well, that is not a statement of science. It's a statement of belief. And so if it's true, it's false. Maybe it's too early in the evening for logic like that, but there's a huge logical problem.
Okay, thank you. Great introductory statements from both of you. I'm sure there's lots you want to respond to there, Peter. Where do you want to begin?
Well, there's so much nonsense to hack away from.
This may be the phrase of the evening, yes.
Yeah. Let's go to what you called the core of your approach, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Never happened. I mean...
Well, that's an assertion, Peter. What about some evidence?
Well, what about some evidence that it did happen, other than people who are writing Gospels of 80 years later than the event that they purport to be talking about? No, of course it didn't happen. How could it happen? And science, I think, could even go so far as saying it simply could not happen. When you've got a dead body, it's decaying straight away. There's no way that it's going to reconstitute in some way. It's absurd. And I accept that it is the foundation of Christian faith. That doesn't mean to say that it's true. And so let's dismiss that as something that simply has no evidence whatsoever of any credible
Before we
nature.
dismiss it, let's hear a response from John, because obviously this is an important issue. What counts as evidence and what are the assumptions
and indeed,
we make?
You know, I suppose you would argue that science cannot explain the resurrection.
Well,
I wouldn't quite argue that way. I would say that science cannot forbid a resurrection, because you see, science proceeds on discovering the regularities to which nature works, and has done a very impressive job. And the fact that we know that dead bodies don't normally rise, that is a law of nature in that sense, means that we recognize something very special happened, if it did happen. Now, there are two issues here. The first of all, there's the in-principle one, which always ends up in talking about David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And I do not believe they are. That's point number one, and I can go into that if you like. Do you want me to?
Do you want to believe? Well, we might as well, since you raised it.
Well, you better define a miracle. I think a miracle is defined as something that is against the laws of nature.
But I don't define it like that at all. A miracle, miraculum in Latin simply means something to be wondered at, but we're talking about something supernatural. Now, it seems to me very clear that when Hume said miracles violate the laws of nature, he was really not understanding. And the great interpreter Anthony Flew of David Hume.
No.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think he was going to object to the raising of Anthony Flew.
Oh, well, I'll not raise Anthony
Let's
Flew.
get back to raising
He
Jesus.
has died and hasn't risen. I do, I do see that point. But the point is this. C.S. Lewis long ago told a little analogy. If I stay in a hotel tonight, put £100 in a drawer, and do the same tomorrow night, there are £200 in it. 1 + 1 = 2. If on the third morning I find 50 quid, what do I say? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of England? Clearly, I say the laws of England have been broken. How do I know? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. It's our recognizing of what normally happens that helps us to see an exception. Now, if I were claiming that the body of Jesus rose from the dead by processes, natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before we happened, yes, that would be wrong. But I'm not claiming that. What Christians claim is that the God that created the universe and built the regularities into it is capable...
Pure speculation.
Wait a minute. No, this is
not worth listening.
This isn't speculation.
Well, let's listen and then you respond, Peter.
Peter, it's dead easy to say it's not worth listening to. You tempt me to say that about some of the things you say, but I'm not going to do that. Because it seems to me it's very important to listen to what Christianity claims before you judge it. And what is claimed is that God who creates the universe and sustains it is not subject to laws as if they were laws of a land. He set up the regularities and he can feed a new event into them. And the claim is, and with this I finish, that God raised Christ from the dead by an input of colossal power.
Oh, Jesus.
Well, you've got it, Peter, in one.
No, I mean, this
that is the claim at the end of the day.
But I mean, this is, everyone knows here that's nonsense. What you're inventing is an agent who can do anything he likes, he or she likes, I suppose you have to say these days. And so it is the laziest way of accounting for observations, sometimes observations that were never actually made. Religious explanations which resort to God did it are intellectually lazy.
But you see, I did say Christianity is not merely a philosophy. And if Jesus Christ really rose from the dead, then that opens up huge possibilities of personal encounter in my life now. And the major reason why I believe that Christianity is true is because, and here comes science again as a base, because Christianity is testable.
Oh, nonsense. How can it be tested?
Well, Peter, let me face that head on. Christ said, when he was on earth...
Didn't, but go ahead.
Christ said that if a person considered the evidence and came to believe that he was God incarnate, who was dying on a cross to give forgiveness and bring peace with God, well, we can test that. I've tested it, and I've seen hundreds of people test it. I mean, take an example. I was lecturing at Harvard a while ago to a couple of thousand people, and when I'd finished, a young Chinese student stood up and he said, "Look at me." So we looked at him, and I said, "Why should we look at you?" He was absolutely beaming. He said, "You should look at me because 6 months ago I came to a lecture you gave at Penn State University. I was at the end. My life was in a complete mess. And something you said triggered a search. And I started to read the New Testament for myself, and I became a Christian. And just look at me now." Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've seen that happen not once, not twice, dozens of times. And when you see addiction to drugs transformed into food on the table, when you see broken relationships mended, and you ask people, "What happened to you?" and they say variously, "I became a Christian, I had an encounter with Christ," you begin to put two and two together and make four. And I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe that these promises that Jesus made actually can be fulfilled in a person's life today. And that's immensely important to me, the testability of Christian relationship with God.
Well, it's a kind of testability that you should leave to the psychologists and the psychiatrists, I think.
But I don't mind the psychiatrists. What do you mean, leave it to them?
Well, because they will understand why these people have found the comfort. Let's accept that it may be comfort.
But that doesn't prove it's wrong, Peter, to use your argument. The fact that Christianity brings comfort is not evidence against it. It may well be evidence for it. If it brought discomfort and ruined people's lives...
a great deal of discomfort. Ask Joan of Arc, for example.
You're raising another question, and I'm Irish. I'm very sensitive to that question. And I could go into it if you want.
Here's where these two men actually start swinging. Atkins opens with a line that sounds simple but is doing a lot of work. Science only deals with real questions, questions you can find evidence for. And anything else, what's the purpose of the universe? Is there meaning to any of this? He just throws out. Not maybe, out. He says there's no evidence the universe has a purpose, so the question doesn't even count as a question. Now sit with that for a second, because that's not a small move. He's not just saying, I don't have an answer. He's saying the question itself is disqualified before it starts. That's a huge claim to smuggle in as if it's just common sense. And here's what gets me about Lennox's response. He doesn't come out swinging. He agrees with Atkins, genuinely agrees that if science just means collecting evidence and comparing notes, then sure, science explains everything, because that's just what careful thinking is. But then he does something sharp. He points to Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner, someone who did real science at the highest level, who said we do science a disservice if we act like it can answer every question. And Medawar pointed back to what he called the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of life? Natural science, plainly, doesn't touch those. That's not an attack on science. That's Lennox saying science is a tool, and you don't blame a hammer for not being able to answer a question it was never built to answer. Then, Lennox drops the line that's the real gut punch of the opening. If you say science is the only way to truth, that statement itself isn't a scientific statement. It's a belief about science, which means if it's true by its own rule, it can't be stated, because it's not evidence, it's philosophy dressed up as science. He calls it a huge logical problem, and he's right. He walked Atkins' own claim into a corner without raising his voice once. Now here's where it gets personal, because the resurrection is where the debate stops being abstract. Justin turns it toward the core of Lennox's faith, and Atkins hesitates. never happened. I mean, how could it happen? A dead body decays. There's no way it reconstitutes. He says science could even go so far as to say it's flatly impossible. And look, if you've ever had a friend hit you with this exact line, you know how it lands. It sounds airtight. It sounds like common sense wearing a lab coat. But watch what Lennox does with it. He doesn't argue that science can explain the resurrection. He says something much more careful. Science cannot forbid a resurrection. That's not a dodge. That's actually the whole hinge of his argument. Science is in the business of discovering regularities, what normally happens. And the fact that we know dead bodies don't rise is exactly what tells us something extraordinary happened if one did. Then he tells the C.S. Lewis story, the 100 pounds in the hotel drawer, night after night, until one morning there's only 50. Do you say the laws of arithmetic broke? No, you say someone took the money. The laws of England were broken, not the laws of math. And how do you know that? Because you trust the math didn't fail, which is exactly what lets you recognize the exception for what it is. That's not a cute analogy. That's Lennox saying the very regularity of nature is what makes a genuine miracle recognizable as a miracle in the first place. It's not a contradiction of science. It's a signal flare precisely because science works so reliably the rest of the time. If you're a believer whose faith has never had to defend itself out loud, this is the moment to actually sit with, because it's not, I feel it in my heart, it's a real structural argument. Atkins isn't done though, and here's where he scores a real hit, one worth naming honestly instead of waving off. He calls it pure speculation, and when Lennox lays out that God who built the regularities can feed a new event into them, Atkins fires back that this is inventing an agent who can do anything he or she likes, and calls it the laziest way of accounting for observation. That's a fair punch. If God did it can explain literally anything, and what sense is it actually explaining something specific? That's the real weight behind abracadabra-style objections, and if you've ever had that thrown at you, it stings, because there's a kernel of something true in it. Here's how it actually gets answered though, even in what we didn't include in this specific cut of the debate, and it's worth knowing even briefly. Lennox's counter, elsewhere in the same night, is that this cuts both ways. If your explanation for anything you can't fully explain is always natural processes we haven't identified yet, that's not automatically more rigorous than God did it. It's just a different unfalsifiable placeholder. The real question isn't which side uses fewer words, it's which worldview actually gives you a coherent reason to trust your own reasoning in the first place. That's a much harder argument to wave off than lazy, and Atkins never really engages with it here. Now, jump forward with us to the second half of this segment, because this is where Lennox stops arguing like a debater and starts arguing like a witness. He says the real reason he believes Christianity is true isn't just philosophy, it's that Christianity is testable. Atkins scoffs. Oh, nonsense, how could it be tested? And Lennox doesn't back off that word. He tells a story, lecturing at Harvard, a couple thousand people in the room, and at the end, a young Chinese student stands up and says, "Look at me." 6 months earlier, his life had been in a complete mess. He heard Lennox speak at Penn State, started reading the New Testament on his own, became a Christian, and there he is, transformed, standing in front of everyone. Here's the single most honest moment in this whole exchange, and it's easy to miss because it doesn't sound like a concession or a gotcha. It's Lennox saying, I wouldn't sit here for a nanosecond if I didn't believe these promises that Jesus made actually can be fulfilled in a person's life today. That's not rehearsed apologetics. That's a man telling you the actual reason he's still standing on that stage after decades of debates like this one. It matters more than every clever analogy in the segment, because it's the moment the argument stops being about logic and becomes about what he's actually staked his life on. Atkins's response is worth taking seriously too, not dismissing. That kind of testimony, he says, is something to leave to psychologists and psychiatrists. They'll understand why people find comfort in it. And Lennox's comeback is sharp and fair. That doesn't prove it's wrong, to use your own argument, Peter. The fact that Christianity brings comfort isn't evidence against it. It might be evidence for it. If it brought only discomfort and ruined people's lives, that would tell you something too. It's a real answer, not a dodge. But be honest with yourself. It doesn't fully settle whether the transformation Lennox describes is God at work or the well-documented human capacity for genuine psychological change through belief and community. Both things can be true. That tension doesn't get resolved in this clip, and pretending it does would be dishonest to you. So where does that leave you, whichever seat you're in? If your faith has never had to survive a conversation like this one, this is what it actually sounds like when someone pushes back hard. If you've got real doubt sitting in your chest right now because of an objection just like Atkins, know that Lennox isn't dodging it. He's naming it and still standing his ground. And if you clicked in expecting the Christian to lose, you just watched him make the more careful, more falsifiable argument of the two. Even if Atkins landed a real punch on where God did it can be lazy. Here's your question, and I want an actual answer, not a shrug. If a life gets completely turned around, addiction gone, relationships rebuilt, and the person says, I met Christ, is that evidence for God, or is it just what the human brain does when it finds meaning? Pick one. Defend it in the comments.